Christmas Eve, 1144. While most of Latin Christendom was preparing for midnight mass, lighting candles and singing and doing all the things that Christmas Eve is supposed to involve, a city on the eastern edge of the Crusader world was falling. Edessa, ancient, symbolic, the very first territory the Crusaders had ever claimed as their own, was being taken apart by the forces of Zengi, the powerful Turkish governor of Mosul and Aleppo. By the time the bells stopped ringing across Europe, the city was gone. The shock was real, and it was deep. Edessa wasn't just a place on a map. It was the oldest of the Crusader states, established even before Jerusalem had been retaken during the First Crusade. It sat at the northeastern edge of the Latin East, like a guardian, a buffer between the rest of the Crusader world and the Islamic powers pressing in from the north. Lose Edessa and you don't just lose a city, you lose the door. You leave the entire flank of the Holy Land exposed. And beyond the strategy, there was something almost spiritual about the wound. Edessa was one of the oldest Christian cities in the world, a place with roots going back to the Apostolic Age. For Christians in Europe, hearing that it had fallen wasn't just bad military news. It felt like a rupture in something sacred. Word traveled slowly in the 12th century, but when it arrived, it hit hard. Pilgrims, merchants, survivors, the stories filtered back west through the winter of 1144 and into 1145, each retelling adding weight. By the time the news reached Rome, it had already become something larger than a military defeat. It had become a crisis of faith, a demand for response. Pope Eugene III responded. On the 1st of December 1145, he issued a papal bull, Quantum Predecessores, how much our predecessors, calling on the kings and nobility of Europe to take up arms in defense of the Holy Land. He reissued it in March of 1146 to make sure it landed. The bull offered the same spiritual rewards that Urban II had promised 50 years earlier at the start of the First Crusade. Full remission of sins, protection of Crusaders' families and property, the chance to do something with your life that God would notice. It was a serious document, a formal call to war wrapped in the language of salvation. But Eugene had a problem. He was a pope in exile, driven out of Rome by political upheaval, issuing commands from a distance. He needed someone who could actually fill a field with people. He needed someone whose voice could do what his couldn't. He needed Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was arguably the most influential churchman in Europe who wasn't the Pope, and some might have debated even that distinction. He was an abbot, a theologian, a letter writer of extraordinary force, and when he opened his mouth in public, something happened to the people listening. He had an intensity to him, a kind of burning conviction that was impossible to dismiss as performance. When Eugene asked Bernard to preach the crusade across France and Germany, it was the right man for the moment in a way that history doesn't always manage. Bernard traveled. He preached. He wrote letters to nobles who couldn't attend his sermons. He granted the same indulgences Eugene had promised, and he framed the crusade not as an obligation, but as an opportunity, a chance offered by a merciful God to people who had done things they knew needed forgiving. He understood that guilt was a more powerful motivator than duty, and he used it with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking about the human soul. Then came Vézelay, the 31st of March, 1146, a hilltop abbey in Burgundy, chosen because no building in the region was large enough to hold the crowd expected. Louis VII of France was already committed. He had announced his intention to crusade months earlier and was looking for the moment to make it formal. When Bernard climbed onto the outdoor platform and began to speak, the crowd pressed forward. By the time he finished, Louis was there with his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, taking the cross publicly. Bernard's own cloth ran out before the demand for crusading badges did, and he reportedly started tearing strips from his own habit to hand to people who were reaching forward wanting to commit. Conrad III of Germany followed. He had initially resisted, telling Bernard he wasn't ready, that Germany had its own problems. Bernard preached to him, again at Christmas that same year in Speyer, and the argument that finally moved Conrad was almost unbearable in its directness. Bernard essentially asked him to imagine standing before God on the day of judgment and explaining why he hadn't come. Conrad took the cross the next morning. So here was the crusade, launched by a genuine geopolitical crisis, shaped by the most formidable preacher in Europe, endorsed by the two most powerful monarchs in the Western world. It carried the prestige of the First Crusade's memory and the theological weight of a full papal mandate. The people who gathered under its banner weren't fanatics or fools. They were believers who had been told, convincingly, that what they were about to do mattered in the deepest possible sense. And it failed. Completely, expensively, and in ways that took decades to fully understand. The question worth sitting with, the question this whole story turns on, is how something launched with this much confidence, this much spiritual energy, this much genuine commitment, could collapse so thoroughly before it ever got close to doing what it promised. Two armies set out across the world in 1147, and from almost the first step, things started going wrong. Conrad III left Germany that spring with a force that was impressive on paper. Somewhere in the region of 20,000 men in total across the combined crusading forces, including around 2,000 German knights, heavy cavalry representing the military heart of the expedition. Louis VII followed with the French contingent, roughly 700 knights of his own, plus the infantry, the servants, the pilgrims who had attached themselves to the column, because a crusading army moving east was also, in the 12th century, a kind of moving sanctuary. These were serious armies, expensive armies, armies that had taken months to organize and bless and equip. They were also armies that would have to walk to a war, through some of the most difficult terrain in the known world, before they fought a single battle over anything that actually mattered. The route took them through Byzantine territory, through the lands of Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, who ruled Constantinople with the particular complexity of a man caught between two sets of people who both frightened him and whom he neither fully trusted nor could afford to fully alienate. The Crusaders needed Byzantine roads, Byzantine markets, Byzantine permission to pass. Manuel needed the Crusaders to not sack his cities, which was less of a certainty than it sounds, given what had happened the last time large armies of Western Europeans had marched through his empire. The relationship was uneasy from the start. Local markets were sometimes closed to the Crusaders as they passed. Byzantine guides provided by Manuel led the armies along routes that may have been less than ideal, though whether this reflected deliberate obstruction or simply the grinding difficulty of moving tens of thousands of people and animals through complex terrain is genuinely contested. Some crusading chronicles accused Manuel of actively colluding with the Turks, of tipping them off to the movements of the army, of engineering the disasters that followed. Other readings suggest the Byzantines were simply being cautious, that Manuel, playing the long game of imperial survival, had every reason to want the Seljuks and the Western Christians to exhaust each other without committing Byzantine blood to either side. Sabotage or pragmatism? The sources pull in different directions, and the honest answer is that we don't know for certain. What we know is the effect. The Crusaders moved through Byzantine territory, feeling watched, feeling mistrusted, and finding their supplies harder to come by than they had expected. Logistics were already fracturing before anyone crossed into Turkish-held Anatolia. The supply lines were long and badly coordinated. Conrad and Louis commanded separate armies with separate chains of command and almost no meaningful shared planning. There were disputes over resources. There was mistrust between the French and German contingents that had been simmering since before departure. An army that starves and argues with itself does not arrive at the battlefield in good condition, and by the time both forces had crossed the Bosphorus into Anatolia, they were already carrying the weight of weeks of attrition. Conrad moved first, and he moved too fast. He struck out into Anatolia ahead of the French, confident, overconfident as it turned out, in the size and quality of his cavalry force. On the 25th of October, 1147, near Dorylaeum, the same broad region where the armies of the First Crusade had won a celebrated victory half a century before, Conrad's army was hit by Seljuk forces in open country. The Turks didn't fight the way German heavy cavalry was designed to counter. They came in fast, scattered when pressed, looped back around, and rained arrows into formations that were expensive to move and slow to adjust. The German army was shattered, not delayed, not damaged, shattered. Conrad himself was reportedly wounded, and what survived of his force limped back to Byzantine territory in a state of collapse. The great German contingent of the Second Crusade had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force before it had reached a single objective. Louis and the French continued. They had to. To turn back now was unthinkable, theologically, politically, personally. But they were moving through a landscape that Conrad's disaster had just rendered more dangerous, with an enemy now emboldened, and a Byzantine partner whose goodwill, such as it had ever been, was cooling further. The march along the Anatolian coast was brutal. The terrain was steep, and the columns were long, and keeping an army together in the mountains meant maintaining a discipline that was, by January, very difficult to sustain. On the 6th of January, 1148, in the mountain pass near Mount Cadmus, the French column lost its coherence. The vanguard pushed ahead too quickly, leaving the rear guard, which included much of the infantry and the baggage, exposed on the slope. The Turks hit the straggling section, and the result was catastrophic. The losses were severe, the baggage was largely taken, and the French force that eventually descended toward the coast and found passage to the Holy Land by sea was battered, depleted, and hollowed out by weeks of accumulated suffering. Louis survived. The army survived, in the technical sense. But the army that would eventually arrive in the Holy Land bore almost no resemblance to the force that had left France with such solemn purpose. And here is the thing worth holding in your mind as all of this unfolds. The crusade had not yet reached its objective. Damascus, Edessa, the whole declared purpose of the enterprise, None of it had been attempted. The armies hadn't even started the part of the journey they had come to do. They had simply tried to get there, and in that effort alone, they had already been broken. What arrived in the Holy Land in the spring of 1148 was the remnant of a grand ambition, carrying wounds that no amount of prayer or regrouping was going to fully heal. What arrived in the Holy Land in the spring of 1148 was, against all odds, still capable of making decisions. Broken armies have a way of convincing themselves they can be unbroken by a single decisive success. And so in June of that year, at a place called Palmyra near Acre, the surviving leadership of the Crusade gathered to decide what it had actually come here to do. The obvious answer was Edessa. The whole expedition had been called into being because Edessa had fallen. That was the wound, and Edessa was the logic. But logic, in a room full of kings and barons and local lords, who all had their own interests and their own fears, has a way of losing the argument. The Council of Palmyra made a decision that stunned some of those present, and has puzzled historians ever since. They would not move on Edessa. They would attack Damascus instead. Damascus was tempting in ways that are not difficult to understand. It was close. It was wealthy. It was a city of genuine strategic weight, sitting at the edge of the Syrian desert, where the roads from the interior converged. Taking Damascus would have been a prize of extraordinary magnitude. But here is the part that makes the decision so uncomfortable to look at in hindsight. Damascus was not at this moment an enemy. The rulers of Damascus had maintained a careful, cautious, sometimes genuinely functional relationship with the Kingdom of Jerusalem for years, a working arrangement born of shared anxiety about a more dangerous threat, the rising Zengid power under Nur al-Din to the north. Damascus and Jerusalem had been, in their peculiar way, something close to aligned. The local lords of the old Crusader states knew this. Some of them argued against the attack. Who exactly argued what, and how forcefully, is one of those places where the chronicles blur and contradict and blame shifts depending on who is telling the story. What is clear is that the decision was made. The objections were insufficient to stop it, and on the 23rd of July, 1148, the army moved. The opening of the siege had a quality of promise about it that must have felt, briefly, like vindication. The Crusaders approached Damascus from the west, pushing into the orchards that spread thickly across that side of the city. Dense groves of fruit trees that provided both shade and cover, and enough irrigation to solve, at least temporarily, the agonizing problem of water supply. The western approach was good ground. The orchards complicated movement, but they also complicated the defenders' ability to organize effective resistance in the open. Early engagements went reasonably well. There was a sense, however fragile, that this might actually work. It did not last more than a few days. What happened next is genuinely difficult to reconstruct with confidence, because the accounts that survive disagree on almost every point of blame and sequence. What seems clear is that supply started to break down again. The orchards that had seemed like such a gift became a problem of navigation and cohesion, the army struggling to maintain clear lines in the thick grove land. Leadership disputes surfaced in ways that the brief early success had only papered over. There were arguments about who would hold the city if it fell, arguments that revealed just how fractured the Crusade's internal politics had become. The local barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, who knew the regional landscape and its political consequences better than anyone, appear at some point to have pushed for a repositioning, moving the siege away from the western orchards toward the eastern side of Damascus, where the ground was more open. That decision, whatever its reasoning, was fatal. The eastern approach had no orchards, no shade, no water. The army that had just spent months being hollowed out by thirst and heat and attrition in Anatolia now sat exposed before a city that was no longer looking like it was about to fall, and with Nur al-Din and his brother, Saif al-Din, moving forces toward them from the north. The threat was not speculative. The Zengid armies were coming, and the besiegers were about to become, in effect, the besieged. On the 28th of July, 1148, 5 days after it had begun, the siege of Damascus was abandoned. The army pulled back. There was no dignified withdrawal. There was no strategic reframing. There was simply the retreat of men who had run out of reasons to stay and who were beginning to genuinely fear what was coming up behind them. The collapse of morale that followed was almost instantaneous, and the collapse of trust was worse. Louis VII and Conrad III were furious. The local lords were blamed, accused by some chronicles of having betrayed the crusade, of having taken bribes from Damascus, of having sabotaged the siege deliberately to prevent the arrival of new Western lords who might claim Syrian lands. Whether any of that was true is almost impossible to know. The accusation itself tells you something. When an enterprise this large fails this completely, the human need to find a betrayer is overwhelming. Someone had to be responsible. Someone always has to be responsible. What is harder to argue with is the outcome. The crusade was finished, not formally declared over, not marched home in any organized way, but finished in the only sense that actually matters. No one believed in it anymore. The kings who had come east with salvations to offer and crusades to win now had only the long journey home, carrying a failure so complete and so public that it would demand explanation for years. The alliance that had been strange and strained going in was coming out, simply broken. And Damascus, which had been cautiously friendly to Jerusalem, now had every reason to look for protection elsewhere, toward Nur al-Din, as it happened, which is exactly what eventually came to pass. When the Crusaders left Damascus behind them, they did not march into some grand final battle or dramatic ambush. They just left. They peeled away in clusters and columns, east and west and north, drifting back toward ports and roads and home. The great Second Crusade, called by a pope, preached by a saint, led by kings, dissolved into the ordinary misery of travel. If you follow those roads with them, something interesting happens. As you move away from Syria, away from Edessa and Jerusalem and Damascus, the story of 1148 starts to look very different. Turn your gaze west, out over the Atlantic winds and the coasts of Iberia, and the same wave of religious energy that broke on the walls of Damascus is doing something else entirely. In the summer of 1147, months before Louis and Conrad even reached the Holy Land, a fleet of northern crusaders had already made landfall at Lisbon. They were mostly from places like England, Flanders, and the Rhineland, originally bound for the eastern Mediterranean. But the King of Portugal, Afonso Henriques, had an offer. Instead of sailing straight on, help him take the Muslim-held city of Lisbon, and the same indulgences promised for fighting in the east would apply here on the shores of the Atlantic. It was one of those moments when paperwork and piety and opportunity line up. The papacy granted the spiritual reward. The fleet agreed. For nearly 4 months, they laid siege to Lisbon's walls, fighting in streets and towers instead of Anatolian passes. When the city finally capitulated in late October 1147, the Crusaders did something they had not yet managed in the East. They won, clearly and undeniably. They took a major city. They secured land and wealth. Some of the Crusaders even chose to stay, settling in the newly expanding Portuguese kingdom. Farther down the Mediterranean, another group of Crusaders lent their arms to the capture of Almeria on the Iberian coast, again from Muslim rulers, again under crusading vows, again with success. In these ports and fortresses, the language of crusade was being carefully, deliberately applied to a different frontier, not the dusty roads to Jerusalem, but the long, grinding reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. These were not trivial gains. Lisbon became one of the key cities of a rising Portugal. Almeria strengthened Christian control along the Spanish coast. The idea that you could take the crusading vow and spend it in Iberia, fighting Muslims closer to home, would only grow more acceptable over the following decades. For local rulers in the West, this mattered enormously. The Reconquista gained momentum, manpower, and a kind of theological endorsement. The crusade might have failed in Syria, but in Portugal and in parts of Spain, it looked like God had answered prayers. And yet, seen from the perspective of Jerusalem, these bright spots were a long way away. The fall of Edessa had been the wound. The Second Crusade had been the bandage. Lisbon and Almeria did nothing to close that original cut on the far side of the Mediterranean. They did not restore Christian control over Upper Mesopotamia. They didn't strengthen the frontier castles of the county of Tripoli or the Principality of Antioch. They didn't plant fresh garrisons along the vulnerable northern approaches to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Strategically, the center of gravity was still the Levant, and there, nothing essential had improved. If anything, it had grown worse. In the aftermath of Damascus, the political fabric of the Crusader states began to fray in ways that were subtle but serious. The barons of Jerusalem had, for years, lived in a tense, pragmatic world of shifting alliances and carefully measured truces. They understood that survival on that narrow coastal strip depended on trust. Not trust in the sense of affection, but trust that when danger came from the north, from men like Zengi and his son Nur al-Din, the Latin West would stand with them. Damascus shattered that illusion. Louis VII went home, nursing grievances against the local nobility and against his Byzantine hosts. Conrad III limped back to Germany, with nothing to show his princes and bishops but losses and excuses. The men who had gone east filled Europe with stories of hunger, of treacherous guides, of Byzantine duplicity, of barons in Jerusalem who supposedly took bribes and changed sides. The precise truth of these accusations is almost impossible to untangle. What matters is that they were believed. For a generation, that belief sat like a weight on the relationship between the Latin East and the Latin West. Requests for help from the Crusader states would now be heard through a new filter of suspicion. Were these people competent? Were they honest? Was it worth bleeding for them again? Relations with Byzantium suffered even more. The Emperor Manuel I had never been an uncomplicated ally. He had his own empire to protect, his own calculations to make. During the Crusade, tensions over supplies, routes, and command had already strained things nearly to breaking point. When the expedition then failed spectacularly, it became politically convenient for Western voices to point at Constantinople and say, "There, that is where it all went wrong." Whether Manuel actually sabotaged the crusade or merely pursued cautious self-interest is still debated. What is clear is that mutual trust between Byzantium and the Western princes, fragile even at the best of times, emerged from the Second Crusade thinner than ever. The chance for a more stable, cooperative Christian front, Byzantine armies and Latin armies working in concert against the Zengids, slipped a little further out of reach. Inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the failure at Damascus had another, quieter cost. For years, Damascus had been a kind of buffer and sometimes partner. Its rulers had worried about Zengid power just as much as the Franks did, and that shared anxiety had produced a strange sort of coexistence. Attacking Damascus ended that arrangement. When the siege failed, the city could no longer risk leaning toward Jerusalem. Its choices narrowed, and gradually it turned north toward the very power the Crusaders had once feared most. Nur al-Din, Zengi's son, did not defeat the Second Crusade on the battlefield. He did not have to. The Crusaders defeated themselves at Damascus, and Nur al-Din reaped the political harvest. Over the following years, he tightened his grip on northern Syria, gathered cities, and built a reputation as a pious, disciplined ruler, fighting in defense of Islam. When Damascus finally came under his control, the map of the region looked very different from the one the Crusaders had hoped to shape in 1148. With Aleppo and Damascus increasingly under one Zengid sphere, the patchwork of rival Muslim cities that had made the First Crusade's success possible was starting to give way to something more unified and more dangerous. Out of that world would eventually rise Salah al-Din, Saladin, a Kurdish commander who first served under Nur al-Din's banner before becoming a ruler in his own right. The road to Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem in 1187 does not begin solely with the Second Crusade, but the failure at Damascus cleared that road in important ways. Back in Europe, the memory of this fiasco had to be managed. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had preached the crusade with such burning conviction, now found himself writing explanations instead of exhortations. He did not abandon his belief that the cause had been just or that the vow had been holy. Instead, he turned the blame inward, arguing that the Crusaders' sins, their lack of purity and obedience, had forfeited God's favor. It was a painful, almost desperate logic. If God could not be wrong, then their defeat had to be their own fault. Chroniclers, too, grope for meaning. Some saw prophecies fulfilled. Others recorded the quarrels and accusations in unnerving detail. Over time, a pattern emerged in how the Second Crusade was remembered. The First Crusade was the story of astonishing triumph against the odds, a tale to be sung and celebrated. The second became something else, a warning, a turning point, the moment when the simple confidence of the early crusading age began to crumble. You can feel the difference in the tone. Where the First Crusade storytellers lean into miracles and victories, the writers after Damascus dwell on confusion, on blame, on what might have been. They do not quite know how to fit this kind of failure into a world that had been promised heavenly endorsement. In the years that followed, crusading did not stop. There would be other expeditions, other vows, other armies moving east and west under blessed banners. Iberia would continue to draw fighters with the promise of land and indulgence. New projects in the Baltic would be wrapped in the language of holy war. The idea of crusade adapted. It moved to where success seemed more likely, more manageable, more profitable. But something in the original project, that first astonishing confidence that a united Christendom could march to the Levant, conquer, and hold, had been damaged in a way that could not quite be explained away. On paper, the Second Crusade ended with the same sea journeys and homecomings that had followed the first. In reality, it closed an era. The West did not just lose a campaign in Syria. It lost a certain kind of faith in itself, in its unity, in its leaders, in its ability to impose its will on the complex politics of the East. What had begun, decades earlier, with a pope in a field promising salvation through war, now faded out, not in a glorious last stand, but in arguments, apologies, and quiet departures from a city that had not fallen. The Holy Land was still there. The shrines still stood. The kingdom still existed on the map. But the initiative, that precious, intangible sense that history was moving in Europe's direction, had slipped away, and it would not be easily recovered.